In our last article and video, we covered the testimonies of Matt and Sarah Blevins. With those testimonies, the defense had come out swinging at the already damaged testimony of Jane Mullins. Exactly how well that was done and to what extent we simply do not know. There is an old saying that says, "The more you learn, the more you know." We never truly understood that statement until we started working on this series. Over the last 10 years, we have literally read thousands of newspaper articles, court documents, and other materials that are directly related to this case or events that happened before and after the Pound Gap Massacre. We have also, on a regular basis, discussed this case between us. This usually happens after discovering something new. We examine what we have learned and how it might fit into the story, or how references from the transcript explained what we have found. These brainstorming sessions let us think outside of the box. This often resulted in a search for documents or other materials relating to the theory that we have proposed. Surprisingly, this method led to a wealth of materials. However, it has only been 18 months since we stumbled upon the theory that the transcript we have, the one touted by Charles Johnson, is the only one in existence, may have been altered before it was sent to the appellate court. We have already spoken about the change in writing style that occurs in the transcript. We have also pointed out that Reuben McFall appears in the transcript under 3 different names. This would not be a problem if there had been a notation about it. But there is no mention of the failed arrest attempt made by McFall in his original testimony. The arrest attempt appears in the testimony of the defense, in which he is just called Rube McFall. This led to McFall being called in the rebuttal phase of the trial, in which he is identified as R.D. McFall, which is confusing to say the least. There is another issue that, up until now, we only mentioned in the testimonies of McFall and Jane Mullins. That issue is that there was evidence of things being left out, such as a follow-up of testimony on Jane's timeline after she admits to arriving back home after the massacre nearly 4 hours later, with no explanation as to where she had been. There is also evidence of testimony being altered with the example of the caliber of the ammunition casings found at the crime scene. This leads to the theory that in most of the testimony, so far, the type of gun and ammunition was changed from 44x70 rimfire to 45-75 centerfire. The caliber of the rifle itself was unknown until the testimony of Sylvan Taylor. The rifle was not placed into evidence until after the testimony of J.S. Wright. Wright was the last witness for the defense and testified that he had shot the rifle during the course of the trial. Sylvan Taylor was then recalled by the court, and the rifle was then placed into evidence. We will discuss this later in the testimony of Doc's son. However, we will point out that part of the testimony given by Sylvan Taylor when he was recalled by the court is still copied verbatim in his testimony. We believe that this was done to make it appear as if the rifle had been in evidence since the beginning of the trial. In the transcripts, the testimony of the defense witnesses are short and appear almost coherent paragraphs. Because of that, we have elected to show them in their entirety. But we must note that this is because of how they appear. Some, if not all of them, may have been altered, as they also seem to be missing content. The testimony of Whit Marshall. The defendant then introduced Whit Marshall, who testified as follows. Quote, I live on the Pound. Have known Dr. M.B. Taylor for about 15 years. I heard of the killing of Ira Mullins and others. Saw Dr. Taylor Saturday before the killing. As he passed my house going to see a sick girl, I saw him after the killing on Thursday. He came to my house and stayed all night. He left his gun and a sack of clothes and did not return until Sunday evening. When he got his gun, which was a Winchester, I do not know the caliber. The clothes he left for about a month. My wife washed his shirt. He did not tell her to do it. I saw Dr. Taylor and the Fleming boys 7 times before Dr. Taylor was arrested. There were parties hunting for Dr. Taylor besides the sheriff. I collected $4 in Pike County, Kentucky for Dr. Taylor, turned it over to a Fleming girl to give to him. I several times saw Taylor and the Fleming boys together. They were sometimes in the brush and always armed." Unquote. The testimony of Mrs. Whit Marshall. The witness testified as follows. Quote, "I live in Wise County on Pound River. I heard of the killing of the Mullinses. I know Dr. Taylor, and he came to my house Thursday after the killing. He left his gun and a sack of clothes. He came back Sunday and got his gun, but left his clothes. There was a coat and vest, pants, and a shirt. I washed his shirt as it was dirty. I examined all of his clothes carefully, but did not find any blood or sign of it. I have known Dr. Taylor for a long time. He did not ask me to wash his shirt. I just done it because it was dirty, and it was but little trouble to me. I saw him several times after he left his clothes, but he never came back after them. I gave them to the Fleming woman. She told me that Dr. Taylor had sent for them." Unquote. The testimony of Mrs. Clifton Roberson. The witness testified as follows. Quote, "I have known Dr. Taylor 12 or 15 years. Heard of the killing of Ira Mullins and others. I saw Dr. Taylor on the Sunday before the killing. He came to my house in the morning, ate his breakfast, and left about 9 o'clock that morning, going towards the pound. I saw him on Thursday after the killing. He took dinner at my house that day. He had no arms at either time that I saw him. He appeared just as he always did. Saw him again at our house 2 or 3 days after that. He had no arms then. I told Doctor that he was accused of the killing, and that there was a mob after him. I heard John H. Branham make threats against Dr. Taylor. He said that he would shoot a hole through Dr. Taylor that I could crawl through, and after he was dead, that he would build a fire on Taylor's body and hear the grease boil. Floyd Branham, Ed Hall, Ed Cox, Granville Cox, Rude McFall, L. H. Gillum, and William Branham were all with John Branham at my house when he used the above language. I told Dr. Taylor of this threat." Unquote. Please note that John Branham, Granville Cox, and Rube McFall were all part of the posse that was involved at the shootout that occurred at the cliffs of the Cumberland. This posse was led by Reuben R.D. or Rube McFall. This will become relevant after Mrs. Robinson was cross-examined. Cross-examination. On cross-examination, witness stated that she had heard McFall was a deputy sheriff, but did not know it, that the witness lives 3 or 4 miles from Pound Gap. Saw Dr. Taylor before the killing, go by her house toward the Flemings. Ellen Alley lives in that direction, and that he was doctoring there. I did not know where he was going. Taylor and the Fleming boys were at my house together 2 or 3 times after the killing, and on one occasion they ate dinner there. Taylor was 2 or 3 times by himself after the killing. A brief look so far. There are several things to take away from these testimonies. The first is, just like the testimonies from the prosecution witnesses, Dr. Taylor and the Flemings were never described as, quote, "men on the run," unquote. Mr. Marshall and Mrs. Robinson both testified that they saw Dr. Taylor heading towards Ellen Alley's, where he was doctoring. Using these 2 witnesses and the testimony from the prosecution witnesses, May Branham and Logan Nottingham, it is possible to create a timeline of events. Mr. Marshall, Mrs. Robinson, and several others testified that on Saturday before the massacre, they had seen Dr. Taylor riding toward Ellen Alley's. Both Marshall and Robinson testified that he was doctoring a girl there. We will find out more about that in the testimony of Ellen Alley. Miss Robinson says that on Saturday morning before the killing, Doc Taylor had breakfast at her house, then left towards the pound. Branham and Nottingham both testified that they saw Dr. Taylor and Cal Fleming at about 10 o'clock Sunday night in Virginia riding hard towards the Pound Gap. Then nobody reports seeing Taylor or the Flemings until the Thursday after the Pound Gap massacre. We will discover the reason for this when we examine the testimony of Ellen Alley. The final thing to note is Mrs. Robinson's testimony about the posse that came to her house. Reuben "Rube" McFall, Granville Cox, and John Branham were all witnesses for the prosecution. The transcript of their testimony leaves out the fact that McFall, Cox, and Branham were all part of the posse sent to bring Taylor and the Flemings in from the clefts of the Cumberland. This incident is one in which Booker Mullins slipped in the mud, discharging his rifle, thus starting the famous shootout. It is only after this shootout that Taylor, Adams, and the Flemings went on the run and into hiding. The real interesting thing here is John Branham. In Branham's testimony, he appears as if he is a good friend to Dr. Taylor. He testified that the Thursday after the killing, Doc had told him that he was going to meet Doc Mullins to swear out an affidavit about Ira trying to hire Mullins to kill him, Taylor. He also testified that Dr. Taylor had told him about an alibi as he had been tending to some sick folks in Kentucky. However, in Mrs. Clifton Roberson's testimony, John Branham does not appear to be a friend of Dr. Taylor. He told her that he was going to kill Dr. Taylor and then burn his body. She had told Dr. Taylor about these statements, but still, Dr. Taylor and the Flemings continued to write the sheriff and tell him where they were hiding and asking for an escort to turn themselves in. Is there any wonder as to why, after that shootout, that all four men, Adams, Taylor, and the Fleming brothers, went into hiding and left the country? The final thing about this is found in the cross-examination of Mrs. Robinson. She is asked if she knew McFall was a deputy. She replies that she had heard a rumor but did not know for sure. There are no further questions along this line of questioning. Is it possible that they have been edited out? That the prosecution or the defense isn't concerned that the posse led by R.D. McFall stated that when they found Taylor that they were going to kill him instead of arresting him? We find this highly unlikely. This concludes the testimonies of Mr. and Mrs. Whit Marshall and Mrs. Clifton Roberson. We at Kentucky, Tennessee Living wish to thank you for reading and watching our series on the Killing Rock. Don't forget to hit that like button, as the more likes we receive, the more likely YouTube is to suggest our videos to other viewers. Also, to receive notification of future videos, be sure to subscribe and click that bell for notifications. We thank you for continuing to support Kentucky, Tennessee Living as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains. We must remind everyone that the story names Killing Rock, The Oft-Told Tales, Killing Rock, The Untold Story, Killing Rock, The Trial, and Killing Rock, The Defense are all under Kentucky, Tennessee Living copyright.